Welcome to another episode of the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. A progressive insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining podcast designed to shine a light on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters, located in his attic, here's the award-winning Pat Johnston.
Oh, yeah! Welcome to another edition of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am Pat Johnston, and I'd like to start with a bit of good news, if you don't mind, because I received an email from the so-called Citizens for Local Choice group. Yes, I decided to sign up because I wanted to see what they were up to. And you know, that's the group that's bankrolled by big land developers and fossil fuel industry people who are trying to stop farmers from allowing their land to be used for large renewable energy projects. Well, after being told endlessly that Michiganders were fed up with Democrats passing laws that gave farmers the right to use their land however they wished when it came to renewable energy, and that this group's efforts to get a repeal of that law on this fall's ballot was a no-brainer, well, guess what? It appears the opposite is true. You see, thanks to many of you out there who've been doing the hard work on getting the message out to people that Citizens for Local Choice were nothing but a front group for big oil and land developers, their petition efforts failed and failed massively. In the email, it says, and I quote here, "The campaign is strong and robust, and while we have not reached the required signature threshold to make the 2024 ballot, we will continue our ambitious efforts to exhaust our legal 180-day window and work through the summer in order to secure a placement on the 2026 ballot." That's beautiful. And this is such a major blow to the fossil fuel industry and those extreme right-wingers who believe we should go back to the chim-chimney, chim-chim-true days of allowing black clouds of smog to hang over our state, because nothing says beauty more than black smog filling our air and our lungs. Oh, that's freedom. I mean, seriously, who is bothered by a solar farm or a wind turbine? Really, who? Who looks at those instruments of cleaner energy and say, I can't believe they're ruining the landscape. We need more coal-fired power plants with smoke billowing out of them, poisoning the air we breathe, which means poisoning us, but we need to line the pockets of big oil even more, so please poison us more, please. I mean, who thinks like that? Who? And at a time when farmers are struggling to make ends meet, which party stood for Michigan farmers and which party stood against them? Don't forget, Michigan Democrats passed a renewable energy siting law as part of their Clean Energy and Jobs Act last year. And this new law, which goes into effect later on this year, allows the Michigan Public Service Commission to give the green light on large renewable energy projects, taking the power out of the extreme right-wing local governments who were blocking these projects from happening, all in the name of MAGA. It slowed down progress. It slowed down Michigan's ability to diversify its energy and economic portfolio, and it also slowed down Michigan's ability to become carbon-free by 2040. Just staying the course was not sustainable. It's not sustainable. It wasn't sustainable for our economy, and it sure the hell wasn't sustainable for Michigan's environment, but that didn't stop the scare tactics from the big money oil and gas industries telling everyone that the new law allows the state to gobble up land. No, it does not. And it only pertains to large renewable energy projects. Local governments still have the power to accept or deny smaller projects, and local governments still have the power to contest any of these big projects, and the energy developers must pay all of the legal costs for contested projects, and the state cannot claim eminent domain ever. It's a smart law, and that's why big oil and gas and land developers tried their best to get a repeal of that law on the ballot this year as quick as possible, because you see, with it being a new law and with these groups spewing all kinds of lies and misinformation out there, they hoped that they could get the repeal on the ballot now rather than later, because you see, if they have to wait until 2026, that gives the law 2 years to illustrate how it's benefiting Michigan farmers and the towns and the counties they live in. And guess what? Many out there probably have never heard this, that the new law says that developers will pay communities $2,000 per megawatt of the project's output to help pay for police, fire, or whatever other infrastructure projects are agreed to by both the local government and the developer. And once people begin experiencing how farmers are able to keep their land and how their local infrastructure is improving out of nowhere, believe me, support for this law will increase. Kind of like Obamacare. Obamacare grew in popularity once people started to see how it benefited so many people, including themselves. I remember how right-wing talk radio had a field day when Nancy Pelosi said people will like Obamacare, will gain in popularity once they learn what's in it. Well, she was right about that one. Now, I emailed a good friend of the podcast, Dick Farnsworth, who is a Montcalm County farmer and also chair of Patriots of Montcalm. Now, Mr. Farnsworth was on the podcast a few months ago, and he's testified in support of the new renewable energy siting law in Lansing. And I emailed him to just get his take on this latest news, and here's what he wrote me, and I quote, "They did come up short with the signatures to get on this year's ballot, but they have another 6 weeks or so to get more signatures. If they get the required number, they can get it on the 2026 ballot. I hope by 2026 there will be enough green energy projects in place that people will see the benefits and not be as fearful. My concern now is that the Republicans could take over the legislature this fall and would be in position to try and repeal the law. Hopefully, they wouldn't have enough votes to override Governor Whitmer's veto. I know that Citizens United is also involved in this, and that is very concerning to me. The Democrats better show up and vote to keep the Democratic majority. The farmers and concerned citizens of Montcalm County are trying to elect township officials this fall that will support landowner property rights and support clean energy production. There are several who are putting solar on their buildings to run the farm. Farmers are some of the best conservationists. Their livelihood depends on a clean and stable environment." Thanks again to Dick Farnsworth for sending me his thoughts, and let this also serve as a reminder that keeping the Michigan State Legislature blue this November is just as important as the national election. And let this also be a reminder of the importance of local elections. Let me repeat, Michigan Republicans voted against helping farmers. They voted against helping rural communities. They voted against helping the environment. They voted against helping push the state into the new age of energy generation. But they voted for keeping Michigan in the dark ages of energy generation, and they voted to keep people breathing dirty, toxic air. And by the way, what happened to property rights? You right-wingers always used to scream and yell about property rights. Not anymore. Wait, what happened? Oh, wait, that's right. There are some conditions when it comes to property rights. Oh, I see. So, a time to celebrate as the effort to hurt farmers, our economy, our energy future, and our environmental future is stalled for now. When people ask what's the difference between Republicans and Democrats, especially here in Michigan, there's one big difference right there. And these are progressive ideas, which are, say it with me, common sense ideas. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, and that's what Republicans are offering. It's another example of how extreme the Republican Party has become, and it continues to drift further and further to the right, not just nationally, but here in Michigan, as we've been seeing for the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years. The Michigan Republican Party, as many of you know, is in the middle of a civil war with the longtime establishment Republicans versus the Christian nationalist America First Republicans, although it kind of might be hard to tell the difference anymore. Andy Kroll wrote an insightful and scary piece in ProPublica titled "Scenes from a MAGA Meltdown Inside the America First Movement's War Over Democracy." It describes the fight happening between the MAGA movement and the Republican establishment here in Michigan. And while the establishment was able to grab some power back inside the party this time, the MAGA movement is still growing. And it's also fair to ask if there's really much daylight between both sides. Andy Kroll is my guest coming up here in just a few moments. He'll join me after this quick timeout. You're listening to LOL,
a podcast that believes in using common sense to move Michigan into the future. And by common sense, we mean progressive sense. We've all seen what 40 years of Republican leadership did to this state, and we refuse to go back. It's the Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. You can follow Pat on Facebook or X. Pat still calls it Twitter. Or on the Gram, Threads, and also on YouTube. Subscribe to the show on YouTube and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. All right, I think we gave Pat enough time to catch his breath. Let's get back to it. Here's Pat Johnston.
Now, I've covered how Trumpism or authoritarianism or fascism has grabbed a hold of a big chunk of the Michigan Republican Party since one could argue that Rick Snyder was elected back in 2010. And that seems like a long time ago. But then again, it doesn't, because even back then, when Snyder, who ran as a smart business exec nerd, kind of more of your moderate Republican, even when he was in office, we were already starting to see this rightward shift within the state Republican Party. And then once Trump became the face of the party, that shift went into maximum overdrive. And while there are some in the party trying to make it electable again, they might be the ones to blame for the Republican Party's extremism here in Michigan and maybe nationwide. So joining me to talk more about this battle for the Michigan Republican Party is Andy Kroll. Andy covers elections, voting, and democracy, or threats to democracy, in ProPublica. And he recently wrote an article titled "Scenes from a MAGA Meltdown Inside the America First Movement's War Over Democracy." Across the country, the Republican Party's rank and file have turned on the GOP establishment in Michigan. The schism broke the party and maybe democracy itself. Andy Kroll, thanks for taking some time out here to talk with us here on Left of Lansing. I appreciate it.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
First of all, you mentioned in your article that you are a native Michigander. So where are you from exactly?
Yeah, I grew up and spent most of my pre-adult life just outside of Kalamazoo, Michigan. I love my home state. I briefly left it for college, but then ultimately I came back and graduated from the greatest university in the history of mankind, the University of Michigan. Ha ha ha. And I get back to my beloved home state as much as I can. My parents, in fact, still live outside of Kalamazoo. And for this story, I actually stayed with them instead of the usual flea-bag motel on a shoestring budget that I do on other reporting trips. So this one felt like a little bit of a homecoming for me.
I know this is kind of off subject, but I'm just going to ask right now. Are you a little surprised to see how certain parts of the west side of the state are starting to turn more blue, like around Kalamazoo or in Kent County and around Grand Rapids? Because that has been happening here for the last couple of election cycles.
Yeah, I feel mixed things about those trends that you just highlighted. On the one hand, I grew up in a Kalamazoo County and on the west side of the state that was pretty conservative, that was pretty red, and just kind of understood that to be the way things worked, the rules of gravity in West Michigan politics. Obviously, a big Dutch population, obviously presence of these dynastic families, the DeVosses, the Van Andels. I wrote in a different piece about Michigan politics about a decade ago that the DeVosses and the Van Andels were my Rockefellers and Carnegies growing up. Their names run hospitals, libraries, and buildings. But on the other hand, the trends that we're seeing in Kalamazoo County and Kent County especially, those are trends that are popping up in other places around the country. You have these urban areas that are growing and younger people are gravitating to them, and they are increasingly becoming blue, becoming democratic. I did not think that I would see the day that these kinds of things would be happening on my home side of the state. But, Michigan, as I write in this latest piece, is useful in that way. It is in so many ways a microcosm of a lot of parts of our country. And you can really pull out some fascinating insights from just looking at Kent County, or if you want to take a different example, Ottawa County, and extrapolate those across the country.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Well, let's get to your piece then, because you described how the state Republican Party had, this huge resurgence during the time you were growing up here, which I'm assuming you and I are close in age, because I would guess that's like around the late 80s and especially in the 1990s.
Yep.
In which like so-called business-friendly governors and policies were pushed by Republicans during the John Engler and Rick Snyder administrations. And I'd say even though we had a Democrat and Jennifer Granholm as governor during the aughts, Republicans always kept the state Senate, and that served as a goalie to kind of block any real meaningful progressive legislation in the past. Not that Granholm was really offering many of those kinds of policies either. But I was just getting a career started in the news talk radio format in Ionia, so not too far away from where you grew up there during the 2000s. And I have to tell you, I was always impressed by the disciplined message machine that state Republicans had in those days. And that was due in part to the successful work by rich and influential donors, like you said, like the DeVos family, for instance. I mean, outside of statewide elections, Republicans really had a tight grip on many parts of the state government. And you write that Michigan Republicans were kind of leading the way for other Republicans across the country. I don't know about you, Andy, but I could tell back then that unless something changed or jolted people awake, Republicans really did build themselves quite the formidable machine that would be tough to beat for many years to come here.
Here's a useful way to think about it. The last time I went back to Michigan for a really in-depth reporting piece was 2013, I believe. I went back to Michigan to write about the right to work law that Rick Snyder, then Governor Rick Snyder, signed into law. A law that he said in the past that he had no intention of signing. It was not on his priority list. And the premise of my piece was how the DeVosses, especially, and a group that they had at the time that was pretty influential at the time, the Michigan Freedom Fund, I believe it was called, had really engineered this stunning legislative coup in the backyard of organized labor, passing a right to work law, something that I think people inside and outside Michigan never thought would happen. And I say that because I look back on that and I think, yeah, that was Michigan in the late 2000s, certainly throughout the 2010s, was up until Governor Whitmer is elected, was this really tightly organized, incredibly well-funded, extremely conservative, but also very savvy conservative establishment in Michigan. And the right to work passage was an example of that, a very stark example of that, which was why I came back to write about it. The link between that moment and this latest story of mine was following Michigan politics, having this context, having this experience about these, influential families, political operatives that would start in Michigan and then go on to the national level, and then seeing them be called the enemy and the globalist and the uniparty by a whole new wave of conservative activists. And it just broke my brain. I had to come back to my home state and try to understand how this happened, why it happened. And again, try to use Michigan as an example of why these kinds of things were happening in other states at the same time as well.
Yeah, because you did write how your home state stopped making some sense to you, and that something was this rise of the America First crowd within the party. In your viewpoint, how were these newcomers in the America First crowd different from the establishment conservatives like the DeVos family, as we've already talked about?
Oh, yeah, there are a number of differences. In the piece that I wrote for ProPublica, I tried to illustrate those differences through actual people, through flesh and blood activists on the ground in Michigan who would sort of guide the reader through the story and help bring to life what those differences are and just how this turn of events happened in Michigan. And so the one person who I thought really exemplified this was a fellow out of Allegheny County, a plumber named Ken Byer. I stumbled across him wading through videos on the website Rumble, which is a sort of hotbed of conservative pro-Trump video content. I found this guy, Ken Byer, who was sort of a leader / spokesman for the America First movement in Michigan. And I ended up spending a lot of time with Ken, very nice guy, totally opened the door to me, gave me as much time as I ever needed, let me ride around in his truck with him at one point when he was going between events across the state. Ken was not a politically active person before 2020. Two things really galvanized him. One was the COVID-19 pandemic and the government's response to that. And then the other was the 2020 presidential election. The COVID pandemic and the public health directives to try to stop the spread and reduce fatalities, lockdowns, school closures, etc. Those really shook him. They really caused him to think, wait, what country am I living in here? And I'm trying to explain the way he's thinking. These aren't things I'm endorsing, obviously. I'm just putting people in his shoes. In the 2020 election, he becomes a Trump supporter and he comes to believe what President Trump, then President Trump, now former President Trump, is saying about the election being stolen. Ken comes to believe that his home state, state of Michigan, great state of Michigan, was pivotal to the Democratic plan to steal the 2020 election. And after that election and after that supposed crime happens, of course, there is no evidence to back up any of the claims that this widespread fraud happened in Michigan. Ken becomes active in politics. And there's this interesting moment in 2021 where Ken Buyer, as I write in the piece, is going to Lansing and asking Republican legislators to investigate the fraud claims that Trump and his allies are putting out there. Most of these legislators, according to Ken Buyer, are like, look, we don't think there's any veracity to these claims. We need to move on. It's not doing the Republican Party any good to dwell on the past, to continue to relitigate the election or January 6th. Let's move on. And to Ken Buyer and to thousands and thousands of other people like him in Michigan and in other states, the Republicans in that moment become just as bad as the Democrats. They become complicit in the things that this growing American First movement believes are wrong with the Democrats and the Republicans. And so when Betsy DeVos resigns immediately after January 6th, that makes her a part of this complicit Republican establishment. When all these Republican leaders across the state, former Governor Rick Snyder among them, say the election wasn't stolen, or we need to move on, or these crazy theories aren't helping us at all, that makes them part of this corrupt cabal inside the Republican Party that the Ken Buyers of the world decide they need to push out of the way and take power from them.
And this America First faction views establishment Republicans just as bad as they view Democrats, right?
Yeah, in some cases worse, because they are supposed to be from the same party as Donald Trump. Why aren't they defending former President Trump? Why aren't they investigating this alleged widespread criminality in our elections, which, again, there's no evidence for? But in the thinking, why aren't the Republicans doing this? In Michigan at the time, they had the state legislature, not the governorship, but the legislature. Why aren't they doing something about it? And they weren't in the eyes of the America First activists. And so the Republicans became just as bad, if not worse, as the Democrats. And that's where this wedge gets driven in. That's where this schism opens up within the party.
In fact, you write, what divides the Republican Party of 2024 is not any one policy or ideology. It is not whether to support Donald Trump. The most important fault line in the party now is democracy itself. Today's Republican insurgents believe democracy has been stolen, and they don't trust the ability of the democratic process or democratic processes to restore it. So if this America First faction doesn't believe in the democratic process, does that mean they don't believe in democracy at all? Is that what you've been able to gather from some of the people like you've been able to talk to in your piece?
I wouldn't go so far as to say they don't believe in democracy at all, but I do think they're bringing a very contorted lens to the question of how should democracy work and what does democracy look like? You have a America First movement in Michigan that not only believes the 2020 election was somehow rigged or stolen, but also that the 2022 midterm elections were not legitimate, as Christina Karama, who I'm sure we'll get to, has said repeatedly, and as other followers of hers have said as well. You also have a creeping feeling, as I observed and heard in my reporting and in my interviews on the ground there in Michigan, that, well, hey, maybe past elections have been fraudulent too. Like, how far back does this go? So you have that feeling creeping in. And then you have this effort within the Michigan Republican Party after Christina Karama has taken over. We can talk more about that. But after she's taken over in February of 2023, to basically change how democracy works, at least in the Republican Party. And that would have looked like getting rid of the August primary elections in which somewhere around 1 million people can vote, and they're open primaries, and replacing those with these closed caucuses where only precinct delegates, these grassroots activist type figures within the Republican Party, only precinct delegates meeting in private together, voting, 8,000 or 9,000 of them, choose all the nominees for the Republican Party. And in some cases, that means choosing who the actual elected official is going to be, because in a lot of these places, especially local races, the primary is the general election. There's not really a competitive general election. That's a pretty radical change to how democracy works. So to answer your question, do I think that they've sort of abandoned democracy? I think that would be going too far. But this is what democracy looks like through their eyes and the things they tried to do to change it. And it's a pretty drastic change from the way democracy works in Michigan right now.
Which there is a little bit of irony there, since they always blame the party bosses on throwing candidates out there that they don't like. Essentially, then they're kind of just doing the same thing, but just so that way it would help their side.
This was pointed out by critics of Karamos and of her administration. You don't like that party bosses or the quote unquote corruption club, as one of Karamo's top aides put it to me. You don't like that they're supposedly puppeteering the party, that they have too much control, and yet you're going to make these changes so that this tiny group of people can basically dictate the most important parts of the Republican Party's role in Michigan's democracy. When I put this to the America First folks, what they said was, we think that the precinct delegates should be the final word in the Republican Party and in Michigan's democratic system. And that if the voters care about who represents them, they need to express that through who they pick as their precinct delegate, which, by the way, was sort of a little-known backwater of politics until a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And then the precinct delegates express the will of the people. It's sort of akin to something that I heard in Kent County at a town hall, actually the same town hall that I write about, the opening scene of the piece. A pastor got up and he said, "We don't live in a democracy. We live in a representative republic." And you hear this, in like literally speaking, you could say, well, yeah, not everything in this country is direct democracy. It's a representative democracy. But you can also interpret that as them saying, we don't really think the best system of government is the individual people casting a vote to make themselves heard. That could also be taken to mean, again, that like the precinct delegates should have as much power as possible, and the voters just pick their delegates, and then it goes off from there.
Yeah, I just say that whenever you hear that term being used, somebody says we're a constitutional republic, my radar already goes up, and that's telling me that's somebody that is more from the right-wing side, in which they pretty much are explaining why they don't like the democratic process. They kind of want to go back to how we used to vote, way back in the 1700s and the 1800s, when it was land was the reason why you had the power to vote.
Well, I thought it was revealing that when I asked different America First activists in Michigan about this plan to get rid of open primaries, again, in which 1 million or more people usually vote, and go to this closed caucus model in which a very small amount of delegates do all the choosing. I had people tell me, well, not only do we think that this is a good sort of policy for running the Michigan Republican Party and for running a democracy, but also this is how we stop the fraud. This is how we get rid of the cheating in the system. If you don't have mail-in ballots, if you don't have absentee voting, if you don't have vote tabulators, you don't have voting machine software, well, you've gotten rid of all of the potential avenues for so-called supposed fraud. And when you think about it, it's like, well, we're really going way back in time if your idea of how democracy should work is basically anti-technology, this sort of pre-mechanical era vision of a small group of delegates sort of raising their hands or writing down paper ballots. It's pretty striking. And I will say that talking about this closed caucus model as a way to get rid of all the voting technology and thus get rid of the supposed fraud, it is something that I've been seeing pop up in other states as well. I think I saw a version of this in New Hampshire. The Texas Republican Party just passed a similar kind of plan at its state Republican convention over this past weekend. Nevada did a similar kind of thing. Idaho has discussed a similar kind of thing. So this is, again, not just limited to Michigan. This is not an aberration, but really a sort of drift driven by this America First contingent in the party.
There's so much to cover here. Of course, you brought up a former Republican chair here in Michigan, Kristina Karamo, how she was ousted. And now we've got former Congressman Pete Hoekstra as the new chair. Donald Trump visited Michigan and pretty much said that Pete Hoekstra, former Congressman Pete Hoekstra, was the new chair of the Michigan Republican Party. And that angered many in the America First faction. And Trump also didn't make many in the America First faction happy when he endorsed Mike Rogers for the U.S. Senate, because they see Mike Rogers as part of the deep state as well. Just from what you've been hearing and what you wrote about in your article, what did people tell you, when it came to Trump getting involved into the state Republican Party politics? And even more, how will that, or will it, affect their vote this coming fall?
This was one of the most interesting findings that came out of my reporting. As I was finishing this story, former President Trump now again, candidate Trump, was getting more involved in these disputes roiling the Michigan Republican Party. He very publicly endorsed former Congressman Pete Hoekstra to be the new Michigan Republican Party chair, and so to replace Christina Caramo. He also, as you pointed out, weighed in the really competitive Senate race to endorse, of all people, former Congressman Mike Rogers, who is not by any stretch of the imagination a favorite of the America First types of the MAGA movement. You had conservative U.S. senators and other elected officials saying that Rogers was a member of the deep state because Rogers had chaired the House Intelligence Committee. I mean, Rogers himself had been really critical of Trump in the past. He'd once described him as more gangster than presidential, referring to Trump's behavior on January 6th. It's really striking that Trump has done this. And what's happened is some of his most devoted followers are starting to distance themselves from him. They're starting to feel disillusioned. I talked to a fellow who was the executive director of the state party under Christina Caramo, a guy named James Copas. And he said to me that he's fed up with the state GOP. He's fed up with the national GOP. He thinks that Donald Trump has become too much of a politician and has lost a bit of his soul. And I heard other versions of this from other people. So, while the national polls would seem to suggest that Trump has a lead over President Biden in Michigan, as well as a handful of other battleground states, I definitely picked up on this bit of discontent and dissension among the Republican base based on how Donald Trump has sort of navigated the chaos in the Michigan Republican Party lately.
They sort of have disdain for Trump sounding like a good old-fashioned politician. Is that what you're saying?
That exactly, which is a sort of ultimate irony, given that his initial appeal, Trump's, was that he was the anti-politician.
We're just about out of time, so I just have one more question to ask you, Andy. We've been talking about this battle between the insurgent America First crowd and the Republican establishment. I'd like to get your take on this. You heard me mention it at the beginning of the segment, and I see this battle between these two sides inside the Michigan Republican Party and the National Party, I guess you could say. But I often wonder what exactly are they fighting about? You say the major difference is how each side views democracy. However, establishment Republicans for years have no one to blame, I think, but themselves, because they built this, what I call, and many call it, obviously, the Christian nationalist America First movement, due to the policies that they pushed for years, like, let's say, defunding public schools and funneling that money to for-profit charter schools, or like decimating voting rights, or through extreme gerrymandering, which we did vote to get rid of here in Michigan, and that was a big thing, or through the constant attacks on abortion rights, or their denial of climate change, or their love of management over workers, on and on and on. I guess what I'm saying is that no matter who ends up on top of this fight, it's essentially a fight just for power, right? I mean, the positions on both sides and the end goals on both sides are essentially the same. At least that's my position. What's yours?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as saying they're the same, because I do think that what the America First folks call the establishment or the globalists or whatever, at least they refuse to buy into all the election denial after the 2020 election and after the 2022 election. I mean, it's not saying they get a gold star for that, because the least you could do is the very basics of our democracy, which is concede defeat when you lose and not go on a conspiratorial campaign to deny that defeat. So I think that is an important distinction. However, I also think that the drift of the Republican Party toward the outer end of the political spectrum happened well before the Ken Byers and the other America First activists came on to the scene. There was a lot of acquiescing, a lot of looking the other way, a lot of different compromises made that got the Republican Party to this point. I am glad that there are some conservatives who will stand up and say, we're not going to abide this election denial nonsense. But there is a strong argument to be made that they looked the other way for a lot of other incremental steps in the party that laid the groundwork for Donald Trump's ascent, for the 2020 election scandal, January 6, 2021, you name it. So yeah, there's a lot of blame to go around, I guess you could say. But also, there will be a reckoning at some point within the party of how do you get it back to a place where, you can be conservative on your policies and your ideologies, but you're not going to condone election denial or any of the sort of anti-democratic strains that run through the party. And that moment is probably coming sooner rather than later, depending on how the November election plays out.
Yeah, we shall see. All right, Andy Kroll of ProPublica, who also unveiled a new book last fall. Can you tell everybody the title of the book?
Yeah. It's A Death on W Street, The Murder of Seth Rich in the Age of Conspiracy. It's a nonfiction book bridging the worlds of politics, true crime, and crazy internet culture. It's one heck of a ride.
All right, I'll make sure to get it. And I'll make sure to link to your articles on leftoflansing.com and wherever people are listening. Andy, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you'll consider coming back on again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's progressivism with passion. It's the Left of Lansing podcast, where Pat shines a light on Michigan's progressive movement. Contact Pat at leftoflansing@gmail.com.
Yeah, I'm also going to link to a recent article that Andy wrote in ProPublica on the refusal of U.S. Senate Democrats, especially Democrats on the Judiciary Committee, to subpoena either Harlan Crow, that big-time rich Republican donor who showered right-wing Justice Clarence Thomas with gifts and vacations, or why they haven't even called in Leonard Leo, the Federalist Society co-chairman who arranged a luxury fishing trip to Alaska for Justice Samuel Alito. So I will provide a link to that article as well. I mean, Senate Democrats must subpoena those guys for what should be well-publicized hearings. With the latest news about the Alito family hanging the American flag upside down to show solidarity with the America First crowd, why aren't Senate Democrats holding hearing after hearing after hearing about this? We talked about how Republicans are never really afraid to use their power, but Senate Democrats appear afraid to use that same power, and it's maddening. Are Senate Democrats missing a crucial chance to put some pressure on the Supreme Court in an election year? Yes, I've been saying it over and over. Run against the court, Democrats. Now, speaking of the U.S. Senate, I like to make the battle for the Senate as the focus for this week's Left of Lansing Last Call.
I'm Elissa Slotkin, and I'm running to be your next U.S. Senator. My life in public service started on 9/11. I joined the CIA and served 3 tours in Iraq alongside our military. I came back to work in the White House for 2 presidents, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, serving whoever was my commander-in-chief. For me, service is not about partisanship. It's about doing what's right to protect our country. I approve this message because I refuse to let politics split us apart. When we work together, there's no problem we can't solve.
Okay, as you heard there, that was a campaign ad for Democratic Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin, who's running to keep Senator Debbie Stabenow's seat on the Democrat side this November. Now, ever since she announced her intentions to run, most Democrats decided not to challenge her. She's a good fundraiser, and she's been a fine representative. I agree with about 80 to 90% of her stances, and I'll support her if she wins her primary. I mean, she's got a huge financial advantage over her opponents, but that doesn't mean everything, so we will see. However, I do wish that some other Democrats would have stepped up and given her a good challenge. Instead, I think many Democrats are sitting and waiting to run for governor in 2 years. But anyway, the fight for the retiring Senator Stabenow seat is going to be crucial for Democrats to win if they have any hopes of keeping the Senate majority, which is why Slotkin's ad kind of confused me. Look, you know I'll take the battle to the right-wing Republicans all of the time, but I'm going to keep it real when it comes to where I think the Democrats are falling short. And I think with this kickoff ad, Elissa Slotkin's team had a pop-up rather than a home run, or at least a solid double. You heard Slotkin tout her years of service with the CIA, and she also touted her record of working for both Democratic President Barack Obama and Republican President George W. Bush. And I guess that kind of an ad would have been somewhat effective during, let's say, the Obama years. But by showing pictures of her and George W. Bush, who was part of the greatest foreign policy disasters of all time with that ill-fated Iraq war, and also was in charge when 9/11 happened, I'm baffled to exactly who will be moved by such imagery. Now, Slotkin's touting her bipartisan record in that ad, and yes, I do believe people are just looking for someone to get the day-to-day job done without all of the unnecessary drama and chaos that right-wing Republicans are bringing every day. However, at the same time, when President Biden and the Democratic Party are trying to warn all of us how democracy is at stake, how can Slotkin say that bipartisanship is more important than ever? Republicans are a threat to democracy, or they're not. All right? You can't have it both ways. You can't normalize them, but then go on to say the country is finished if they win. Also, this is the time to draw contrasts between you and the Republicans. Show images of January 6th. Talk about how Republicans will cut even more taxes for the wealthy while costing the country trillions. Maybe you talk about how you're a steadfast and staunch supporter of abortion rights and how you'll forever oppose a nationwide abortion ban. Talk about how you're never going to waver on contraception rights. Talk about the need for more housing and lowering housing costs. You know, you could talk about student loans and the need to cut those loans. Talk about how you'll always support union rights, kind of an important topic here in the state of Michigan. Talk about how you'll be a voice of marginalized people in the state, while Republicans will only be a voice for extremism, division, and hate. Explain how your values are Michigan values. Look, I know I'm not a paid political consultant. I just play one here on the podcast, and I can tell you I've been wrong many, many times. But I think now is the time to plant the seed and show voters how you're willing to fight for them and how you're going to fight for them. You could also show them your recent video, Congresswoman, in which you blasted House Republicans for proposing a $30 billion cut to the SNAP food stamp program, the biggest cut in 30 years. And by the way, that did pass the Republican-led Ag Committee. Show everyone, like Senator Stabenow has already announced, show everyone how you would block any kind of draconian cuts to SNAP. Show the contrasts. Show the extremism of the Republican Party. Showing pictures of you shaking hands with W. Bush, who might still be the worst president of all time, doesn't really draw much of a contrast at all. And by the way, why isn't George out there every day shouting at the top of his lungs how much a threat dear leader Trump is to the nation? Where is he? Where was George? Oh, that's right. He appointed Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court, who erased Roe v. Wade and who is helping stall some of dear leader Trump's court cases. See, W. Bush might still be the worst president of all time.
You're listening to the Left of Lansing podcast. The music you're hearing is by Wanderbeats. To hear the latest project, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site. Now back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Left of Lansing. Special thanks again to Andy Kroll from ProPublica for joining me this week. I'd like to say a quick thank you to the show voice Jessica for all of her awesome work, and thank you to Rich for all of his work with leftoflansing.com. Please don't hesitate to contact me. That's leftoflansing@gmail.com. And is it just me, or is everything blooming earlier this year? Hey, I'm just glad climate change isn't really a thing. Until next time, take the battle to them. Thank you, Michigan.
The Left of Lansing podcast was produced by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and hosted by, yes, Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. And thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. Remember to visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to the Left of Lansing podcast.